Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Democracy Dialogues, where we go beyond the headlines to unravel what's really shaping the Americas. I'm your host, Eric Farnsworth, coming to you again from Washington, D.C. Today, we're taking an in-depth look at Mexico's June 2024 elections, elections which are unfolding within a complicated political environment, an environment characterized by certain tensions and developments, including violence against candidates. We'll discuss that issue. We'll also discuss key factors influencing the elections, from the role of the president and his Morena party, to the evolving landscape of independent institutions like the National Electoral Institute, INE, and also the press. We'll also explore the intricacies of recent controversies, including the Supreme Court's decisions and proposed constitutional reforms. Additionally, we'll examine the broader implications of these elections, considering their potential impact on Mexico's democratic trajectory and sociopolitical landscape. To dissect the dynamics and implications of Mexico's upcoming elections at this critical juncture, we're honored to welcome Luis Carlos Ugalde. Luis Carlos served as the president of INE from 2003 to 2007, a period which included the 2006 elections, which were the most complicated in Mexico's modern history. He also has extensive experience in various governmental and academic roles, and he's also the founder and president of Integralia consultancy. He's been on the front lines of Mexican elections, and he's here to help us navigate through the complexities of Mexico's electoral process and the significance for the United States and the region as a whole. Luis Carlos Ugalde, welcome to Democracy Dialogues.
Thank you, Eric. I'm glad to be here with you.
We've got some important elections upcoming in Mexico in June. What's your sense about what we should anticipate? And are these different in any way from previous elections in your experience?
I could say that this is the most relevant election, not because of who is going to be our next president, but because what is at the table is the possibility that our constitution is amended in very important ways, basically to dismantle the judiciary as we know it in Mexico, and basically to politicize the nomination and the appointment of justices to the Supreme Court in Mexico. That is on the table, and that is the reason why these elections are very relevant. We're going to elect a president, and the two leading candidates are women, which is something new. And today, at least today, the likely winner would be the official candidate from Morena. So this is the second reason why this election is important, because since 2018, when López Obrador came to office, we are experiencing our first populist experience in politics in Mexico. And if Morena wins again, this could be the second. And the question many Mexicans make, and you make in the US, is how this second experience of populism in Mexico would evolve and what the impact of this could be on Mexican democracy.
You have pointed to some pretty dramatic potential changes that could occur as a result of these elections. What do you anticipate is the likelihood that that might actually happen?
It is unlikely that the official party can win a constitutional majority to make these changes I mentioned before. Our estimate at Integralia consulting firm is that the official party and allies would get about 55–56% of the Mexican Congress, which is like 50 votes away from that majority needed to change the constitution. So in one sense, it is unlikely. However, the new administration could buy the votes needed to change the constitution. So there is some danger there. And let me be clear why this is relevant, because in Mexico, beginning in 2000, when we have the first alternation in the presidency, we began a slow process of building a functional democracy with checks and balances. And this checks and balances system is just beginning to give some results. And the Supreme Court has been a key player in keeping the executive branch in control with constraints. And if you politicize the Supreme Court, if you dismantle, if you change the way justices are appointed, then you would make this branch of government submissive to the executive branch, and that would simply break down this system of checks and balances. And then legal uncertainty, lack of controls would evolve, and that always hurt democracy. That is the reason why this is so important.
One of the institutions that you know very, very well is INE. Would you put INE in a similar circumstance in terms of an institution?
Yes, INE would be the second institution in danger, because in the 1990s, beginning in the 1990s, the Elections Institute was part of our transition and has been able to organize clean elections and fair elections. And López Obrador, since 2006, when I was president of INE, he attacked INE and accused INE of being part of a mafia del poder, of an elite that was constraining him from accessing to power. And even now, he's accusing INE and institutions in Mexico of blocking democracy. He says that. So if this plan is successful, then INE is going to be overhauled. The organization of elections in Mexico would change, and eventually that could mean that fair and free elections could cease to be the norm in Mexico.
But just to be clear, INE is an independent, nonpartisan, autonomous organization within Mexico, correct?
Yes, it's an independent, because in the 20th century, the elections were organized by the government, and that created a lot of suspicion, and sometimes there were many accusations of fraud and rigged elections. It became independent in the 1990s, and López Obrador has attacked INE because he says it is very expensive, it says that it is partisan, it says that organize rigged elections. That is not true. Indeed, you know that INE has been an example and a leading institutions worldwide to provide technical assistance to other electoral bodies in the world. So it's one of the best institutions in the world, but in Mexico, López Obrador has attacked INE. By the way, to give you an idea, in the US, you are very familiar with this because of Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump rejected the outcome of the 2020 election and accused fraud. That is somehow what populist leaders do worldwide. When they lose elections, they accuse the elections institutions of doing that. So in Mexico, López Obrador has done that. Even now, as president, López Obrador continues to put in doubt the independence of our electoral organization.
But you wouldn't suggest that the elections in June would somehow be corrupted or anything like this?
This election, these campaigns are very unequal on our terms. And basically because López Obrador has interfered in the election in Mexico, in contrast to other countries, we have a very strict regulation in which public government officials are prohibited from talking about campaigns in process. And López Obrador has interfered. He has attacked the opposition. So this is an unequal election on our terms. However, the election is going to be clean in the sense that the INE is going to count votes, and the votes that come out from the ballot boxes are going to be those that define the winner. So it is going to be a clean election in that sense, so we can be confident of that.
Yeah. I think that's an important distinction. Let's change the focus a little bit to one that also impacts elections, also impacts democracy, but certainly impacts daily life within Mexico and indeed around Latin America and other parts. That's violence, the prominence of organized cartels and violent actors within Mexico. What's your concern about those issues in the context of democracy for Mexico?
The survival of the Mexican state is at risk because 20 years ago we had problems of illegal drug trafficking going into the US, and we had a lot of problems with this country because of that illegal trafficking. But today the problem has multiplied because drug trafficking groups of the past 20 years have evolved into criminal organizations with many businesses, with like big corporations doing illegal drug trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, and other types of illicit crimes. So this is happening, and these organizations have multiplied, and they want to take control of territories throughout Mexico. So today in Mexico, of course, we have most of the cities which work in a legal manner, but many territories in the countryside which are under the control of these criminal groups. The problem is that if this expansion continues to happen, at some point in the future, then, as happened in Colombia 3 decades ago, then the state is going to lose sovereignty and control of substantial parts of the Mexican territory, and that is, of course, a problem of survival. Today in Mexico, and this electoral season, we are experiencing the most violent process. Up until now, there have been about 25 candidates killed in action. And this is, of course, one of these aspects of this problem that is exploding in Mexico.
And is this politically motivated violence against candidates of one persuasion or the other, or is it random violence, or is it geographically based? I mean, help us understand what sort of candidates are being targeted. I mean, this is not just a human tragedy, but political. It's outrageous, but help us understand what's behind that.
The reason of this is that criminal groups want to take control of candidates running for office, because when they get elected, they want to have the possibility of influencing them and have control of the local administration offices. So when a candidate means that they can be independent of criminal groups, they kill them. Most of the candidates running for office in those regions controlled by criminal organizations usually simply accept the rules of the game. But those that do not accept or are part of another group are killed in action. So the question at this moment is that it is basically candidates at the very local level, municipal level, those who are killed now. In recent days, a person running for a city office in the city of Celaya was killed, but basically are local candidates for local offices, because those are the regions in which our criminal organizations want to take control.
Yeah. We were rocked in this country, but also Mexico, of course, as well, in the 1990s when a leading presidential candidate was assassinated. And I think it drew a lot of attention to the real threat, and that was 30 years ago now. Colosio, of course, I'm talking about. But this, what you're describing, is something at the local level, at the state level, that's happening throughout Mexico somehow, and I suspect that has implications of the candidates who decide to run, the issues that they decide to focus on, and perhaps their effectiveness in office once they're there. I think that's a really important point you're making.
The assassination of Colosio, who was a presidential candidate in 1994, was of a different nature, because it seems to be the case that he was killed by a man that was simply crazy about him and killed him, but he was not member of a criminal organization.
No, I wasn't implying that.
Yes, yes. Just for the people that are listening to this conversation. Today it's of a different nature, and this is, of course, what is happening now. If we now see candidates at the very local level being killed, in the future that can go bigger and bigger, and that is a problem, as happened in Colombia in the 1980s and 1990s.
Yeah, no, I was pointing to the impact of violence on the political process from, for whatever motivation the violence occurs. But no, I think these are points that we don't often focus on here in North America, and we need
now,
to do
let
more.
me tell you something. Despite this violence that is very worrisome, we are going to have an open election with high turnout. That is at the same time. This is happening In some regions, with some people, we have had 25 candidates killed, but this election is going to be huge, of about 20,000 local offices elected. So this is marginal in some sense, but very worrisome in a different aspect.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. We're here with Luis Carlos Ugalde, who is the president and founder of Integralia Consultores. Before that, he was Secretary of Energy in Mexico. He was also the head of INE, the National Electoral Commission in Mexico. Luis Carlos, let's change the focus a little bit. You raised a topic that I want to explore somewhat. The two leading candidates for the presidency of Mexico are both women. It's almost guaranteed, I suspect, that the next president of Mexico will be a woman. Congratulations, that's meaningful progress. We haven't yet achieved that in the United States. Perhaps at some point we will. My question to you is, how is this going to impact politics in Mexico, and what could we anticipate based on some of the new actors that are coming into prominence within Mexico?
I think it is, rather than gender, other aspects are more relevant to this election. But let's talk about that both leading candidates are women. I think that is positive, because in a machista country like Mexico, having a woman at the top office is always a good example for the people. Indeed, in Mexico, we have some of the most progressive legislation to support gender-based politics, like gender equality politics. In the Mexican Congress today, we have 50-50 women and men, something unthinkable 20 years ago. To give you an idea, in your Congress in the US, you have 25% of women at the most. In Mexico, we are very, very equal in that regard. Now, at the top of the office, a woman, I think that is good. And especially because both leading candidates, in my opinion, have a very good profile. I mean, on the one hand, the official candidate is a scientist. She has a PhD. She has a good government experience, a huge government experience, and many people criticize her because she's the legacy of López Obrador, and López Obrador has been a very disruptive person in politics in Mexico. She has polarized the huge political arena in Mexico, society in general, as populists do, as Trump does in the US. But probably she's going to be a nicer face to populism in Mexico, because she's not a populist by herself. And maybe that is good. On the other side, Xochitl Gálvez, the opposition candidate, she's an entrepreneur, she's a very inspiring figure, she's a very honest woman. So both of them, I think, has good perspectives and good profiles to be a good example at the top of the Mexican political system. We hope so.
Would you anticipate that whoever's elected in Mexico, and we'll watch that very carefully, of course, from this side of the border, what would that mean for relations with the United States? Do you see any particular divergences between the leading candidates on how they might address the bilateral relationship, which arguably is the most important for Mexico, and is clearly the most important, certainly one of the most important for the United States?
The U.S.-Mexico relationship will depend more on your election than our election. And of course, if Mr. Trump wins the election, which I hope it doesn't materialize, that would change it very much. But on our side, I don't see many difference between Mrs. Sheinbaum and Mrs. Gálvez. Indeed, this has not been an issue on our electoral process up until this point. And I don't think the Mexican electorate understands and wants to have specific ideas on that. So I think the U.S.-Mexico relationship will depend on how your election is resolved. If Mr. Trump comes to office, I think it will be a difficult relationship with Mexico and with the rest of the world, indeed. I would say that in terms of trade and migration, it will be very difficult to create cooperation between Mexico and the U.S. But at the same time, Mexico is so important in terms of the trade relationship vis-a-vis China, that I would say that there would be a pragmatic approach by a Trump presidency with regards to Mexico. So the U.S.-Mexico relationship will continue, because you cannot fight China and at the same time fight Mexico. That doesn't make sense. So I think on that regard, trade will continue to evolve and to multiply.
I mean, the point you're making is so fundamental, which is to say that both the U.S. and Mexico have so much at stake mutually in terms of our mutual self-interest to cooperate and collaborate. And yeah, we're going to have disagreements from time to time, and sometimes they'll be quite dramatic disagreements, but what's at stake is fundamentally much more important. And hopefully both countries can recognize that going forward. But yes, politics will prevail. Let me touch on a topic which is very sensitive in the U.S. Scenario in our own presidential elections and campaigns, but certainly impacts Mexico. You already mentioned it, migration, which is a topic that is going to be one of the primary ones when the United States public really begins to focus on the U.S. elections. How would you sense that either Sheinbaum or a Galvez administration might address some of the migration issues, not just in terms of vis-a-vis the United States, but in terms of Mexico? Mexico has its own issues with migration from Central America, from China, elsewhere. Has there been much discussion of these issues on the campaign trail within Mexico?
No, this hasn't been an issue on the campaign trail, and I don't think it will arise as a main issue of discussion in Mexico. And none of them has discussed this openly. There is no proposal on that. So we don't know. How I think we should manage that, on the one side, I think we should continue to bargain with the U.S. With respect to having a legal framework to open visa for Mexican workers, especially now that you in this country will continue to require workers. And at the same time, we need to regulate the inflow of migrants into Mexico, because sometimes we cry at the way you treat our migrant workers, and we do the same with the people coming from Central America. So we have to talk about that, but at this moment in Mexico, we already require some migrants to come to work because of the lack of sufficient workers to work in Mexican factories to supply the U.S. market. So we need to work on that, but that discussion is not occurring in Mexico.
But again, this is another example of a topic that is mutually beneficial to both of us, that should frankly bring us together as opposed to divide us, but it's so divisive here in the United States.
And it will continue to be so.
Yeah.
Yes.
In the short time we have remaining, let me come back to a topic that we started with, and that's the role of the President of Mexico, not now, not in the run-up to the election, but after the elections. There's a lot of questioning in terms of assuming his candidate's elected, because it would be as relevant if the opposition candidate's elected, but if Claudia Sheinbaum is elected President of Mexico, how much direct involvement or indirect involvement would you anticipate that the outgoing President López Obrador would seek to have in the forthcoming administration? Will he still be an active presence politically, or will he do what many other Mexican presidents have done, which is to perhaps seek a teaching role somewhere, or to have a different profile? What's your sense of his desire to remain active in Mexican politics?
López Obrador will leave office with a high popularity of about 55–60%. That is a very good number.
One of the highest in the region, if not the highest, yeah.
And he will continue to be very influential, because his legacy within his movement is huge. And Mrs. Sheinbaum, if she is elected president, she thinks very much like him. She is following the legacy, and I don't see any reason for her to break with this past of López Obrador. So I think she wants to continue with that. I think she wants to use the legacy of López Obrador as part of his support base. But at the same time, gradually over time, within a few years, she will become, let's say, independent of that legacy. I don't see that Sheinbaum will be like a new president with new ideas, breaking down with the past. She doesn't need to do that. She doesn't want to do that. She will be less powerful than López Obrador. She will have less resources, fiscal resources, to do things in Mexican politics. So she will depend very much on the legacy of López Obrador. So, but at some point, I would say she will become independent of that, and that will happen maybe within the first 2 years in office. So one of the fears in Mexico is that López Obrador will continue to be the mastermind of Mexican politics. And I think the legacy is more important than this mastermind down there. So, and eventually López Obrador will be gone. I would say that. I mean, our Mexican political system is more institutionalized in that regard than many people suspect.
That's a really good place to end our conversation. Regrettably, our time is not greater because I'd love to continue, and I hope you come back to Democracy Dialogues. Your insights are just very profound. We'll see if some of the predictions come true, and we look forward to continuing the conversation as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Eric.
And thanks to all of you for joining us here at Democracy Dialogues. Join us the first Thursday of every month for a continuing conversation of the most important democracy issues facing the Americas. And until then, please work with us to ensure that democracy delivers for all of us.
We're further along on this route to a hemisphere that's more united and prosperous.
The Western Hemisphere is our home. And because it is our home, it is imperative that we promote democracy and good governance, security and prosperity within the region.
Democracy is essential for the social, political, and economic development of the peoples of the Americas.
I think the United States needs to engage in the Western Hemisphere like it has not in generations.